Today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez is a special episode with my guest on the program, Tyler Martinolik. This recording was done through Zoom, and just a little heads up, there was a technical glitch or difficulty in the middle of the interview, so just be aware of that. And it's a breakdown of the movie A Place in the Sun from 1951, which I chose, directed by George Stevens, starring Montgomery Clift, Elizabeth Taylor, and Shelley Winters. In this episode, both me and Tyler talk about the breakdown of each sequence from beginning to end, the importance of the casting choices, Stevens' wonderful direction, and so much more throughout this interview. So, besides that technical glitch that I have just mentioned, and be aware of that, I hope you enjoy this special episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. Enjoy. Okay, so we are here because I have set up this interview for a special episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, and this is a breakdown episode of a film that I have chosen, specifically A Place in the Sun, and my guest for today, he is a member of Film Tampa Bay. He is, if I got this right, are you the executive director of the Film Tampa Bay Commission?
I am the film commissioner for Hillsborough County.
Okay, you are the film commissioner for Hillsborough County, and it's great to see you for this special episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez.
I appreciate being here. Thank you for the invite.
Okay, so right now, I had just rewatched it last week to get myself prepared, and it's been more than 10 years since I last saw this film. And I specifically chose it because it's been in my memory for, as I said, more than 10 years. And I just, when I first saw it, it just felt like there was not that much that I could think about at the time. I was just only in it because, I wanted to know what the film was about. But now that I have rewatched it again, I felt that it feels somewhat timely and relevant because of its themes and because of the subject matter in the movie. So when did you first watch the film before we delve into the topic?
Sure. I mean, I've enjoyed classic movies most of my life. So I've seen A Place in the Sun 5 times, I think. Though like you, I also rewatched it recently in prep for this. But I'd say the first time I saw it was probably late 80s, early 90s. So right. It's been a while since I saw it for the first time.
Okay. So I know I have seen other George Stevens films like the movie Shane. He also did a film called Giant and The Diary of Anne Frank, which I remember watching when I was in school. And also, I think I watched it on VHS before I saw it on DVD and on TV. But he has a fascinating, prolific work. He started directing comedies, and then after the war period, he started directing these melodramas and these really prolific drama films that are very effective.
Yeah, and not only that, he was also a prolific shooter. So in addition to directing, I think, over 60 movies, he was a passionate director of photography, a person very interested in how the camera works and how blocking and framing are affected by lenses choices and different lighting schemes, which I think is sort of unique to his work. So in addition to, again, directing 60 plus movies, he also was a cinematographer on over 80 other additional projects. So just a prolific filmmaker in many, many rights. But I think his most famous projects are probably A Place in the Sun, Shane, Diary of Anne Frank, and you mentioned Giant as well, though he had a ton of other films. He operated mostly in the 30s and 40s with a couple of movies in the 50s, and then sort of went into retirement after that. But in the sort of the prime of his let's say directorial I should say it. In the prime of his sort of directory mode before he got more into cinematography, I think Place in the Sun is probably most emblematic of his interests.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also the one that showcases his directorial choices the most as well.
It does. And it does show so much as well. So, what I also like about the film, and obviously I do want to get a little bit into the breakdown, but before we do that, I actually had to do a little bit of research before I got into watching this film again. I did remember I had to look up, like, the film was based on originally a play called A Place in the Sun, which in turn was based on the novel An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser. And it was originally filmed. There was an early version of that story by Joseph von Sternberg that is now available on Universal Archive Classics. I haven't gotten to see it, but it's the earliest version of that story. And it's a very, I don't know, it sounds like a very sort of like breaking the artificial illusion of the American myth story is how I conceived of it when I first saw it again.
It's interesting because I'm also very familiar with Sternberg. One of my favorite films is Scarlet Empress, which is one of his directorial features. But Sternberg's version is very different than Stevens' version.
Mm-hmm.
I think that largely has to do because of the time in which they were operating. Sternberg was making films prior to the Hays Code and then just in the bubble of the Hays Code, whereas Stevens, directing in 51, is firmly within the Hays Code period. And for those who are watching or listening and not familiar with the Hays Code is, the Hays Code was sort of like the moral guidelines that Hollywood was forced to adopt in the early 30s. And once that was in place, you really couldn't tackle subject matters like murder or abortion or classism the same way as you could prior to the Hays Code being implemented. So you have the same material essentially, but two very different films because they were made in different times. And I think that's what really makes the difference between Stevens and Sternberg's films so stark.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think of the casting of Montgomery Clift, of Shelley Winters, and Elizabeth Taylor in their respective roles? You have Monty Clift in this really interesting performance. He sounds innocent when you get to meet him for the first time, but when you get to look at the psychological aspect of his character, he starts to be completely like become a different person when you get to know what he's really thinking about, as well as like the characteristics of Shelley Winters, who is this very mousy type character. But before, she was actually a really great actress in these types of roles. And then Liz Taylor, when she made this film, I had to read that this film was made in 49, but it was not released until 51 because I read that it was in competition with Sunset Boulevard, and Paramount, the studio, didn't want these two big films to be in competition with each other at that time.
I thought the casting was very interesting. So, you have both Taylor and Winters giving a over-performative performance, in my opinion, where it's very melodramatic, very hyperbolized, and that I think that works really well against Montgomery Clift, who really is the straight man for most of the film. He's very quiet, very nebbish. He internalizes a lot of his acting, which I think Stevens really highlights. There's a lot of these interesting scenes where they just sort of hold on Montgomery Clift and he's sort of staring into the camera, and the music swells, and it's almost like a real-time example of the Kuleshov effect, where the audience themselves are having to figure out what is he thinking inside, because he's not emoting, he's just looking into the camera. I think it's a beautiful artistic choice, both in Stevens' ability to pause and hold the camera and not feel like he needs to move on, but then also Cliff being able to recognize that and just be in the moment and sit there and internalize the emotions. And that comes up several times in the movie. So I think the casting is excellent. And I think the way each of the actors approached their characters really complemented the other actors in the scenes. So I think you couldn't have had an over-the-top performance like Taylor has without having, again, that sort of straight man reservation from Cliff to work off of. And you put them two together and it's like peanut butter and jelly, right? It just works together really well.
It does. It does work really well when you see the performances of Winters, Taylor, and Montgomery Clift in this film. So now I want to break down maybe like some of the, to me, some of the big scenes in the movie. So the film begins with Monty Clift. He is hitchhiking to see his uncle, whom he mentions later in the film. He remembered meeting at I think it was like at a meeting in New York. And then
He was a bellhop at a hotel that his uncle was staying in, and that's how they ended up running into each other.
yes. And so he is telling about like his backstory, about the fact that his mother was, as we find out later in the film, she is a missionary. She has her own like little missionary place where she's helping save souls. And then we find out that he previously did a lot of religious work because of, I don't know if in the film his mother was religious. They never mentioned the father in the film.
So no, so the father was made out to be a sort of a street pastor or a street priest, and then obviously at this point he's passed on, presumably at a younger age, and then his mother went on to run an orphanage and do some mission work out somewhere. They never really explain where she's at or where the orphanage is at. But we also learned that Cliff's character participated and was with his parents when they were preaching on the street, and participated in the mission work himself.
Mm-hmm. So that's the one thing I do remember as I was rewatching this film. And also when he was trying to get a job at his uncle's factory, his cousin, whom I don't think they mentioned in the film they met before, but this was like his first time meeting his cousins. So his cousin assigned him to work at, I think it was like an assembly line, and all of the workers were women. And I think he was the only male worker, which I found to be very odd that he was the only male worker working in the assembly line and all the other workers are women. That I thought he could have worked somewhere else, but I don't know why they made that choice. But it just felt a little bit strange to me to put him into that position. And he felt like he was getting along with Alice Tripp in the movie, played by Shelley Winters. And then we sort of see that at first the relationship seems a bit awkward, and then they start to get a little bit comfortable with each other, even though it may seem a little bit nebbish. And then later in the film, as there's a scene in the film where he's talking with Alice Tripp, and they're walking past these little stores and signs, and she asks him, when you're an Eastman, you don't feel like you're fitting with us, because if you're an Eastman, you're part of them, you're part of the upper class, and I don't have. It's interesting that she doesn't have that sort of same background that he does, because she doesn't have that like same backing from a rich or wealthy family, which is what I think I got from this sequence.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You have to look at the original source material as well. So American Tragedy was written in 1925, I believe. So a very different time period. You're dealing with post World War One America. We're not quite to the Great Depression, but we're coming up on it. And there is not a lot of hope left in America. So there really is a glut of authors, people who participated in World War One or came back. We often call it the lost generation, who were very keyed into the haves and have-nots, right? So this really is a story about classism and the advantages certain people have. That's highlighted both in how the upper class treats the lower class. It's in how Shelley Winters' character, once she becomes pregnant, how she doesn't really have any way to support herself or to have her own choices, because she is not of a class where she can afford to have a baby. And what does that mean? Which I think you're right at your intro. This is very prescient in today's climate as well. And it's interesting in that factory scene. You mentioned early on, he comes to his uncle, and his uncle had promised him a job. And his uncle doesn't really care that much about his nephew, but he feels some sort of familial responsibility to help his brother's son out. So he puts his own son in charge of his nephew, and the nephew doesn't know what to do with him, right? Or his son doesn't know what to do with him. So he just finds the the lowest common denominator job he can, which is working on the assembly line. And this company makes women's clothing, women's lingerie. So he's put on an assembly line packaging women's clothing with women. He's the only male there on the assembly line working. That's not to say there's not a lot of men in the company. Everyone in a management or leadership position is male. So I think it's significant that he's put on that line with her, because that's where the classism comes in. You know, she's poor, but remember, he's also very poor. That's set up very early on, that he was doing odd jobs, working as a bellhop. Before that, he was with his family being a street preacher and a missionary. He does not have a lot of things. So at the beginning, he's given a job with people of his same class, right? The same opportunities. And I think that's why that initial relationship between Clift and Winters feels so organic, is because these are two people who don't have anything and they've now found each other. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, she brings up very early on, in fact, in that scene, you're an Eastman, and Eastmen don't work the factory line. You know, you might be here today, but tomorrow you're going to get a promotion. Like, mm-hmm. I see where this is going. And I think it's at that point that he starts realizing that he needs to cash in on his name to climb the social ladder. So when he does get that promotion, you start feeling that estrangement between the way he's able to interact with Winters, and then now at this point, Elizabeth Taylor's character, who is of that upper class. And you see that push and pull where he still has feelings for Winters, but also sees the opportunity and then the allure of having wealth and power and status. And I think that is really distilled very early on. And again, in that scene on the factory floor, where he's just stacking boxes. He's the only male there, looking dejected. And then out of the blue, as his uncle walks through and says, "Hey, I happen to be passing by. I was thinking about you. You know, here's a promotion," right? And as soon as he gets that promotion, he's on a different trajectory. Even though he's someone of low status socially, he now sees a means to an end of attaining what his uncle has. And I think that sets the course for the rest of the movie. But they never let him forget that he's poor. I think that comes up later on in the movie when he is, I think, up in the Catskills with Elizabeth Taylor and her family, and they're having a Labor Day weekend amongst a very wealthy crowd of people. And Elizabeth Taylor's parents basically say, "Hey, we just invited him up here to make a fool of him so that my daughter will realize that he's a person of low birth." So even though he sees...
Hello? So right now, Tyler is having a little bit of technical difficulties, but we will be returning as soon as he comes back. Okay, you're back. I don't know what happened.
What happened there? I just dropped off.
Okay.
But I'm back. Where was I? I'm sorry.
Okay. You were talking about how George Eastman was being hired by his uncle to now be promoted. And of course, because he still has that class difference. And now you were talking about he was meeting, George Eastman was with Elizabeth Taylor, Angela Vickers' parents. And they were talking about, and he was asking, "Why should I have you marry my daughter, even though I don't know who you are or what your background is? And tell us a little bit about your background, because I never heard of you before."
Yeah. And you know, that scene, it's so honest, where he sort of acknowledges the fact that he comes from nothing and he doesn't deserve Elizabeth Taylor as a significant other because she doesn't fit in the same social circles. And that's one of the few moments where I think that the classism, you know, sort of breaks, and Stephen gives us a reason to be sympathetic towards Cliff's character, because he's not terribly sympathetic through most of the movie. Mm-hmm. You know, even though he's our protagonist, he's someone who gets a girl pregnant, who no longer feels that he needs to be socializing with her because he should be of higher social status. So then he trades her out for the newer, better model, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then we know he's contemplating murdering her
Yes.
throughout most of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a very hard character to sympathize with. But I think that scene up in the Catskills where he's talking to Elizabeth Taylor's father and talking about his background, we see the person he was and still could be. An honest person, someone who cares about others, who is a family man and who wants to do right by his family. But then at the same time, we move on from that scene, and he tries murdering his girlfriend. So
Yeah,
it's again a very hard character to like.
it is. He's like an unsympathetic character, basically. He's a flawed character. He's not a perfect character overall. And when we find out that he has to carry on this responsibility and he's trying to delay of trying to marry Alice Tripp because he knows that if this secret comes out, I think he mentions that if this secret comes out, his family would no longer recognize him anymore. It's almost like he would be shunned out of the upper class society, and it would be a huge scandal for the Eastman family, of course, if they find out about this. And of course, Alice Tripp later finds out in the film when he tells her, "Oh, I'm going to be with my uncle at the summer home in the lake, and then we will think about getting married later." And then it turns out there's a scene in the film where she goes through her mail and she finally sees the truth that he was not with his uncle, he was with the Vickers from this newspaper article that she found with a picture of him and Liz Taylor. And she feels heartbroken. And now she feels like the only way to get this through is to marry him, or else she will tell everybody about this secret that he's been hiding.
Yeah. Uh, and what I like about that scene too is it shows how the lower class look and I don't want to say, maybe the word is idolize the higher class, the higher socialites out there, because he's on the cover of the feature section with Elizabeth Taylor, and they're in a ski boat looking
Yes.
happy on a lake.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those sort of like trash celebrity magazines that you would read to learn about your favorite celebrity crush, at least
Mm-hmm.
today, right? But back then. And what I think the movie does a good job in portraying is just how weird and detached the upper class can be from the problems of the lower class. They're very mocking of people of lower status. They don't seem to have a grasp on the reality or the economics of the world around them because they don't care. I
Mm-hmm.
think a great scene that shows that off is when Liz Taylor's character is speeding through the mountains
Yeah.
and she gets pulled over by the cops, and they write her a hefty ticket. And they even mentioned like this is the third time this month you're getting a ticket, and she
Yeah.
just doesn't care. She basically tears it up and smiles and says, "Have a nice day, officer," and drives on because she can get away with that.
Yeah.
Uh,
That is so true.
it
Um,
is, and I think that's something that's really important about this movie because I think it works today too, where you have the top one percenters and the lower class, and there's this economic infighting of the have and have nots. And I think it's just as true today as it was back then.
it does. It that's why I feel it's so relevant when you watch this film. And then we get to Monty Clift. He is thinking about what is he going to do with this situation, and he's thinking about this date that he's setting up. And then I remember there's this radio story that's been playing about these disappearances and how these women were drowned, and it's an element of foreshadowing. It's foreshadowing what Monty Clift is going to do with Alice Tripp, because now he has to contemplate with trying to appease to the upper class, while at the same time Alice Tripp is very furious and she's frustrated. And there's a scene where he's on the phone at their place, and Alice Tripp is saying, "You have to marry me today. It cannot be tomorrow. It cannot be next week. You have to do it today, because if you don't do it today, I'm going to tell everybody about what you did. And I'm going to tell the papers and I'm going to tell everybody." And so he goes to the station where he meets her. And then they try to get married inside the courthouse. But unfortunately, it was closed. So instead, he says, "Well, I'm. Why don't we go to the lake? Why don't we go see the lake? It's beautiful out there." And then we start to see the motors gearing up towards the, I would say, climactic moment. I don't know if anticlimactic is the right word, but I think climactic moment. He's pretending that the car is stalled. He's going out to get the boat and to boat rent, and they're now in the middle of the lake where nobody could see them. And then we see the music swell up and we see Alice talking, and she's thinking about what's going to happen and not realizing that. And I love the use of the lighting in that sequence. It's perfect lighting because it emphasizes what his character is thinking internally. And also, uh, it's almost like we're watching himself distancing himself away from Alice Tripp, because we are noticing that he is now no longer the sympathetic character. He's becoming basically a murderer
Yeah.
for this sequence.
And it's going back to what I was saying earlier, where Cliff would just stare out in the camera, and Stevens would hold on them for a long amount of time. The radio program he's listening to, where it's talking about, hey, we're having all these fun times up in the lake, but remind you, like, be safe, don't drink too much because people are drowning. We had 4 deaths in the lake this year, and you hear this in the background. He's just sort of staring into the camera, and we realize that he is thinking about those deaths, how he can put that to his advantage. He knows he's going to the lake. How can I get her up there? And you don't have to tell us any of this. Like, he doesn't. It's like he's sitting there with a billboard behind him with lines drawn everywhere. This is how I'm going to do this and that. Mm-hmm. We just know we can put the pieces together because the filmmaking is done correctly.
It is.
But what I love about the actual scene itself, so we know he's luring up or trying to get her up there to murder her on the lake. We know that's his intention. When she shows up unexpectedly and he decides to take her immediately to the lake, we know that's what the outcome's going to be, or we think so. But that scene goes on for a long time. It's a very drawn out scene. And it's because it's taking as long as it's taking him on screen to sort of internalize what it means to murder someone, and can I actually go through with it? Mm-hmm. And you're right. As they get further and further out, more and more remote on the lake, and as time's passing, because it starts out in the morning, and by the end of it, it's in nighttime, right? That she's talking about the stars are out. Mm-hmm. And he's getting further and further away from her in the boat, right? So he is rowing, and then he moves back a seat, and by the end, he's all the way to the prow of the ship, leaning up against it, as far physically away from her as he can be. And it's because he's distancing himself from her, but he's also distancing himself from the idea of drowning her as well. So we see him go through the motions of trying, or knowing he's going to murder her, to by the end of that scene, we as an audience are pretty sure he's not going to go through with it. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, Shelley Winter's character is going from, we're going to be really happy, it's going to be great. And then she starts getting more and more melancholic. Man, I don't see any people. Wouldn't it be great if there was no more people left on the planet? What if it was just us? What if we were just alone? And then that devolves further to where now he's no longer thinking about murdering her, but she's talking about killing herself. And she gets more and more frantic and manic until she stands up in the boat, and he starts yelling at her, please stop, sit down, don't come any closer. And the irony is that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. She doesn't know how to swim very well. She's the one that ends up tipping the boat over, and then the screen cuts to black. Yeah. And it comes back up. We don't know how much time has transpired, but the next thing is we see, Montgomery Clift's character dragging himself out of the water up onto the shore, and she's nowhere to be seen. But in the distance, we can see the capsized boat bobbing up and down in the very back of the lake.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So then we noticed, I don't know if they were Boy Scouts or young boys that were out in the woods.
I believe it was a Boy Scout troop.
Okay. So the Boy Scouts noticed he was walking, and he gets to his car, and he's trying to get back to the vicar's house, because I think it was the vicar's house that he tried to get back to. And then all of a sudden, we don't get any word about the drowning incident until like I think a day or so later. And then we are introduced to Attorney General, I think his name was Warwick in the movie. I might not be sure. And it's played by a young Raymond Burr before he was Perry Mason. And I think it's one of the few times you ever saw him play a non-bad guy role. But he plays his character so well in the film. And also, as you are watching this film, you notice that they're trying to get the information out. And as they are working on trying to get the case of the drowning incident and also who was behind it, Monty Clift, he's just having fun. He's trying to avoid getting away from this whole murder situation. And it's almost like every time he tries to avoid it, he keeps seeing people jumping in the water. He keeps people telling him, oh, he drowned her like this. And it's almost like, dude, you're doing this out in the open. You're literally making him want to confess that he is responsible for this thing that he knows won't go away.
Yeah, and it's yes. So there's that pressure because he keeps running into things that are reminding him of what happened. Though we come to find out later that he has no memory of what happened, at least in the trial. But going back to the Boy Scouts, there's also the dog that starts barking. And the dog now becomes a motif moving forward throughout the movie, where they use it as a transition, where every time he's starting to feel the guilt, a dog starts barking, and then it moves on to the next scene. And that dog really becomes sort of a symbol of him being found out. And I think it's his own conscience saying that, something bad happened. You need to own up for it. And I think that plays out through the rest of the movie in a really ambiguous way, because we as the audience also do not know if he killed her or not. We were in the scene with them. We assume that she drowned of natural causes. But as the district attorney brought up, and I think his actual name was Marlowe in the movie. I think it was
I think you're right.
Chaucer. Yeah, some Chaucer novels. But he could have saved her, right? Was he unconscious too? Did he hit his own head? They make it out to be him being a very strong swimmer. They mentioned that several times. So he could have been in a position to save her. Did he see her drowning and decide not to save her? Did she knock herself unconscious? She was already dead. We never find out the answer to that. Even when he's, spoilers, he's being led to the electric chair when the movie ends. We still don't know if he chose not to save her, if she was already dead, or if he hit her. We have no idea.
And it's also evident in the trial sequence. And this is a good time to segue because I'm almost running out of time. I don't have like the pro for Zoom, but we'll just wrap it up to like the trial scene where he's being put against like, Raymond Burr his character is trying to lay out, maybe he intentionally tried to murder her. Like he has this big boat out and he has this big oar, maybe like he smashed her on the head, which we never saw him do that, but that's what the attorney general is thinking that he may have done, but we don't know. As you mentioned before, we don't know. And then we are later found out that he was guilty for, I don't know if it was because he was guilty of manslaughter. It might have been a passing memory for me. But as we get later to like before he is sentenced to die in the electric chair, we get like some of the characters in the movie, like his mother, played in the film by Anne Revere, who was blacklisted. I think it was from 1951 until 1970 when she came back to the screen. And she says something to the effect of, I pray to God that you are a good person or something like that. That's what I'm trying to remember. And then Liz Taylor's character, Angela Vickers, comes back to see him one last time before he dies. And I don't know if those are the only two characters who came to meet him one last time before he was sentenced to the electric chair.
Yeah, so his mother definitely plays a big part in the end, where she's basically saying, "I'm praying for you. It's my fault." And he says, "No, Mom, it wasn't your fault." But there is another person in the cell with him. And that's the priest, who's come to read him his last rites. Yeah. And he's trying to get him to confess. And he never does. No. I mean, he basically maintains the line that I don't know what happened. The boat tipped over. I don't remember her seeing. I hit my head. She hit her head. I heard the boat land on top of her. And the priest slowly guides him through guilt, not to admit that he killed her, but to admit that he wanted to kill her in his heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what the confession he finally pulls out of him, where we're right before he's being led to the electric chair, is that, the last question the priest asked him is like, you're guilty if you thought about killing her and you wanted to kill her in your heart. And he said, well, maybe I did.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of a realization, but is he remembering, or is he just accepting guilt for all of the things that happened? I've seen this movie a couple times. I still maintain that he did not kill her, and he did not probably intentionally leave her to die.
Mm-hmm.
I think he sort of washed up on shore, and it was true that he had no memory of it.
Mm-hmm.
But to the priest's point, he's still guilty of something, right? And that needs to be accounted for. And to sort of end this, why this is important, because I think if this was made in modern times, it'd have a more ambiguous or a more definitive ending. I don't think it would be the sort of the clear cut you have right here with this particular thing. But because this was made during the Hays Code, you cannot show a murderer on screen legally at this time without showing punishment being enacted. So there was no other choice than for his character, just because of the way Hollywood was operating at the time, he had to admit guilt and he had to be punished for it. So I've never read the original novel. I don't know if that priest is in it as well, or if that's a manufacturer of the movie process. But it is a really interesting, ambiguous ending. It's up for interpretation. Is he guilty in his heart? He believes so, I think, at the end. But did he actually kill her? I don't think so. I don't think that's established in the movie.
I don't think so either. Well, one last thing I would mention before we end this interview. I do want to mention that the priest in the film was a rare on-screen appearance by legendary cartoon voiceover artist Paul Frees. He had done a few live on-screen appearances, but it's great that he got to appear in this film. I didn't know about it until I found out about it later. But as you mentioned, it is a very ambiguous ending. We don't know what happened. I think in my consciousness, he may have, I don't know if he killed her or anything like that, but it's up to interpretation as well. So I do want to thank you for coming to this special episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, and also for giving your insight onto the film A Place in the Sun. And it's a wonderful film in my heart that I feel should be seen by maybe somebody who has never heard of this film, or maybe somebody who was thinking about, watching it, but were very hesitant to see it. But it's a great film. I love the direction by George Stevens. I also love the cast members in the film as well. And I also love the music and everything else that made this story possible. So thank you again for coming on to this special episode.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Really appreciate it. I hope people do go out and see this movie. It's readily available on Amazon. There's no excuse not to. If you were listening to this and were intrigued, I hope you go watch it.
Okay, thank you so much. And
thank you, Jordan. Bye-bye.
Bye. You have just been listening to a special episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, and Google Podcasts every Friday, as well as a special mini-sode every Monday at 12 p.m. It is also on my blog website, filmtalkwithjordanramirez.wordpress.com, with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.